For all that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service.
What if the most explosive royal decision was never about removing a title at all, but about quietly deciding that Harry's place beside the crown had already reached its absolute end? Behind closed palace doors, William allegedly walked into a private meeting carrying a position he had no intention of softening, and what followed was not a dramatic royal spectacle, but something far more devastating. A boundary designed to make sure Harry and Meghan could never again turn the question of royal duty into a negotiation. There was no grand announcement, no gathering of the entire family, and no carefully staged ceremony. Instead, William reportedly arrived with a decision already formed. The question was brutally simple. Could Harry and Meghan ever return to official royal life? William's answer was apparently no, not temporarily, not through selected ceremonies, not through a carefully managed comeback. The door to working royal status would remain closed, and that distinction mattered because working royal status means carrying out official duties on behalf of the monarch. William was not necessarily declaring war on his brother. He was drawing a line between family and institution, and that line may have been the most emotionally loaded decision yet. Charles listened without interrupting, because Harry was not merely another former royal. He was his son and William's younger brother. That made the decision almost impossible to separate from the emotions surrounding it. But William reportedly believed hesitation had become its own danger. Every attempt to leave the question open created another opportunity for arguments about access, appearances, status, and future responsibilities. So the future king chose something colder: certainty. Meghan, too, would have no restored official representation. There would be no gradual return disguised as a few ceremonial appearances, no symbolic invitation designed to test public reaction, and no middle ground quietly waiting behind the scenes. William's position was apparently that reconciliation and reinstatement had to become two completely separate things. Reconciliation could still happen privately. Reinstatement, meaning returning someone to formal royal duties after stepping away, was another matter entirely. Then came the moment that made the decision feel less like policy and more like a verdict. William placed the document flat on the table and refused to reopen the wording. That tiny gesture suddenly carried enormous weight. The paper itself was only a framework, but what it represented was much bigger. It meant that the old question whether Harry might someday return was no longer going to hover over every family conversation, and that is where the real emotional explosion began. Long before titles, interviews, statements, and public divisions, William and Harry had been brothers carrying the same extraordinary inheritance. That history made this decision painful in a way no palace briefing could disguise. William was not judging a stranger. He was deciding the institutional future of someone who had once stood beside him through grief, duty, marriage, and adulthood. Harry reportedly read the message once, then again, slower the second time. The shocking part was not simply losing a possible official role. He had already created a life outside that structure with Meghan. The deeper wound was discovering that William had personally insisted the uncertainty disappear. Harry reportedly looked toward Meghan and asked whether the wording had come directly from his brother. Meghan did not need much explanation. Palace language has a way of revealing what it refuses to say. Between those carefully constructed lines, there was no limited duty, no selected ceremony, and no negotiated return. William had removed the gray area completely. For Harry, that clarity could feel almost like rejection. For William, however, it represented responsibility. As heir, he had to think beyond one family argument and toward the predictability of the monarchy itself. The heir is the person next in line to inherit the throne, and that position changes the calculation. A private disagreement can be forgiven. An institutional structure that repeatedly creates uncertainty is much harder to contain. But Harry's reaction was becoming increasingly personal. Losing the formal pathway was one thing. Knowing that William himself had decided the pathway should no longer exist was another. Meghan could see the shift. This was no longer simply about palace mechanics. It was about two brothers reaching completely different conclusions about what their relationship should become. The answer reportedly began months earlier during one final private attempt at reconciliation. That meeting was supposed to create clarity. Instead, it may have created the opposite, the realization that the same argument could continue forever unless someone finally stopped it. Harry entered that conversation wanting answers, but frustration had already been building. William remained willing to speak as a brother, yet Yet he wanted those conversations kept separate from questions of royal status. A working arrangement meant a formal agreement allowing someone to perform selected duties or appearances for the crown. And William feared that every attempt at rebuilding trust would eventually circle back to that same question. The real confrontation came when the brothers finally faced each other without advisors standing between them, and suddenly all the polished palace language became almost useless. Harry wanted to hear the decision directly from William, not through another carefully prepared message. William agreed because if he was truly responsible for closing the institutional door, then Harry deserved to hear the reasoning from him. Harry made it clear that the permanent restriction felt less like policy and more like a judgment on everything that had happened since he left Britain. William listened, but his frustration was unmistakable. Years of uncertainty had poisoned private conversations because every attempt at family contact seemed to drift back toward royal status, appearances, access, and the possibility of returning to duty. Harry asked whether anything could ever change the decision. William paused, but the pause was not hesitation. The formal question was already settled. There would be no partial return, no negotiated role, and no reopening of the institutional debate. The silence afterward was brutal. William then made the distinction he had been trying to protect all along. Closing the royal door did not mean closing the door to brotherhood. William explained that royal roles could not remain permanently available for renegotiation whenever family relations improved or deteriorated. Every unresolved possibility created another argument, another expectation, another public controversy waiting to erupt. Charles understood the reasoning, but the father in him resisted the finality. He knew Harry might hear institutional separation as personal rejection. William did not deny that danger. Instead, he insisted that the distinction had to become clearer precisely because the emotional consequences were so severe. Private reconciliation could survive only if reinstatement was removed from the equation. Then came the moment that transformed the entire dispute. Charles looked at the final page, lifted the pen, and asked William one devastating question: "Are you certain?" The answer was yes. Charles signed. With that single act, the framework gained institutional weight. The palace could no longer treat the issue as temporary or unresolved. Calendars, invitations, briefings, and future expectations would now reflect a completely different reality. For Harry and Meghan, the change appeared in details that looked insignificant but carried enormous meaning. A name could disappear from a planning document. An invitation could arrive without official designation. A future ceremony could be planned without leaving a ceremonial space open for a possible return. Harry would still be family, but any appearance would be personal rather than official. Meghan understood immediately what had disappeared, the possibility of negotiating a gradual comeback. Yet William made one surprising distinction. He refused to turn his brother into a stranger. Advisors could manage official matters, but William did not want every private interaction reduced to palace correspondence. The institutional door was closed, but the personal door remained unlocked, and that became the strangest part of the entire story. Harry and William eventually spoke again without lawyers, aides, or prepared notes. There was no royal framework on the table and no position to bargain over. Harry admitted that the decision still felt too absolute, but he also recognized something painful. The uncertainty was finally gone. William admitted that the decision had hurt him too. He never wanted every conversation to become another argument about the crown. Then Harry offered the concession neither brother had been able to make before. They would stop talking about the job. No dramatic embrace followed. No magical repair erased years of damage. But for the first time, the monarchy was not sitting between them. Outside that room, however, the story was already becoming something else entirely. Headlines reduced years of pain to a single question: was there truly no road back? And once the public began choosing sides, the silence surrounding the family became even more suspicious, because the royal door may have been closed, but the personal story was clearly not finished.